And I put some other links in there as well that I will talk about in a second. But thank you so much all for coming. I just have a quick explanation of why ISU Open Ed Week exists. The library got really interested in OER this year when we reviewed some recent research that we thought was really compelling and told a story. 42% of Florida college students in 2018 said that they took fewer courses because they could not afford their university textbooks. And in a meta-analysis that came out in 2019, we found that courses that adopted OER saw a 29% decrease in their withdrawal rates. And I think those two studies taken together kind of paint a story about how financial situation can really impact a student's retention. And what we've seen this week with some of our other presenters is that OER is not just beneficial for student retention, it's also beneficial because it opens up your pedagogy and it gives you opportunities to try new things. And so that's what we're going to hear a little bit more about today with Dr. Roby and Dr. Stango. Before we get started, I just have a few quick announcements. I want to make everybody aware. This is really exciting. ISU is now a publisher, an ebook publisher. We have a platform called Pressbooks that if you're interested in writing an ebook, we can get you set up and you can have a platform to do that. We also, our collaborator, Daphne Sang on the OER committee, has created an OER course in Moodle, and you can self-enroll in it to get access to training materials, including recordings from this week, as well as get announcements about any other OER events that are going on campus. And in addition, everyone should know that next week, March 1st through the 5th, is actually a statewide open education conference. It's Idaho Open Education Week. I put the link to their homepage in the chat. But if you don't have time to check it out now, you can just Google Idaho Open Education Week and it will pop right up. And so I hope you'll take a look at that program as well. So today's speaker is not me. Without further ado, let me turn it over to our speakers. We have Dr. Sarah Roby and Dr. Marie Stango here to talk about their OER adoptions in history. So let me turn it over to you.
Great. So thank you so much for organizing this week of events. This is really exciting. I can talk really briefly about OER in one of the courses that I teach, which is U.S. History 1, History 1111. It's U.S. History Survey Course to 1865. So this was a course that I got a grant to find and research and use OER materials to change the course from the sort of traditional textbook setup to entirely OER materials. Now, I think it's helpful to know just a few things about history courses, particularly at the lower division level, especially the Gen Ed courses that Dr. Roby and I teach, which is an Objective 6 course. Which is social science methods. And, history courses generally use textbooks and primary sources together. So a traditional textbook narrative, particularly at the lower division level, is common. And then we typically combine that textbook with primary sources, which are documents, artifacts, materials produced during the time period that we're studying. So if we're studying the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence is a primary source, right? In any case, lots of history professors teach courses very, very differently. If you get 10 of us in a room, you're going to get 10 different answers of how we approach these courses, particularly the survey level course, which is ubiquitous throughout the US. Pretty much every university I know of teaches this. One of the things that we need to balance in a course like US history is how much content can we possibly cover and what kinds of skills do we want our students to develop, particularly because it is a Gen Ed 6 course. So content is tricky. So I teach the first half of the US survey, which means I need to cover nearly 400 years of US history in 14 weeks. So some content is going to be cut, right? We're not going to simply list out things and hope that students remember. So the emphasis that I choose is going to be different than the emphasis that Dr. Roby will choose. And indeed, she's taught this course and we teach it very differently. So in any case, OER was an opportunity to re-examine the concepts, the skills, the content that I was using in my course to really redesign it at a very fundamental level, to redesign the assignments, to redesign what we covered in the course, to think about how I wanted students to use the textbook versus how I had them using a traditional textbook. So really, I ended up with a quite different course than the one that I started with. One of the things that I do want to shout out is the ITRC, and particularly Daphne, for help with all of this. I mean, really, this is it was a very long process, and some of the things were easier to do than others, and Daphne had just wonderful suggestions and support throughout. So for any faculty who are thinking about using OER, get in touch with the ITRC for sure.
Yeah, I will echo a lot of what Marie just laid out. So I teach the second half of the US survey, which is more or less the Civil War to the present. But like Marie said, we have both taught both of these courses, and indeed, my approach is different than anyone else who could be tackling the class as well. I think we'll get into this with some of the questions, Kristen, that I think that we'll be discussing, but my experience with this was, I sort of suspect that two things helped get me and Marie kind of, hit the ground running, in addition to the ITRC, hit the ground running with this process. One is that as American historians, there are certain advantages to what's available and what's available online and what's available in English too. So, before we get into this too deeply, the fact that we teach American history kind of gives us a different experience than, say, our colleagues who teach world history or ancient history or history of other places where English is not the dominant language. So that little caveat up front. And then the second thing is that because we are trained to teach courses using a textbook type thing, as well as these primary sources that Marie mentioned, we're pretty well accustomed to kind of gathering primary sources for our students in the first place. Maybe we weren't thinking about that as exclusively an online process or an open access process, but nevertheless, we're geared towards that sort of objective from the get-go. And I think that made the transition into OER a little bit easier for us, not unproblematic, not totally simple, but there are kind of these factors that are going to separate our experience from that of other certainly other folks in other disciplines, but even people within history that don't teach the same in the same field as we do. I think probably I'm going to save the rest of what I'd like to talk about for the Q&A, but I do want to also thank everyone for putting this on this week and having us here to talk.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to have you. And just so the audience members know, we just thought we wanted to do something a little more conversational. So I have some questions for Sarah and Marie, and we can probably do it so that one person answers first and then we switch the order. So Sarah, what was it that piqued your interest in OER? How did you find out about it, and what really caught your attention about it?
Yeah, so like a lot of the folks at ISU, I think we heard from our chairs and deans about this grant opportunity to explore the possibility of using OER in our classrooms. And so formally, that's what got me into the formal research and implementation process of using OER in my classes. But more broadly, I think that historians, first of all, like our textbooks that we use are typically fairly low cost to begin with. And that's something that I think even before we as a field were talking about OER, I think that was on our mind as far as what we assign. There are some textbook series in history that are like $70 or $80. Most of us don't use them, because we understand that our students are also taking science classes that cost $300 for their textbooks and that sort of thing. So the cost conscious aspect was built in from the moment I started teaching, I think. prior to going fully OER, I would say that my survey level textbooks typically cost maybe $40 on average. But through the process of researching for this program, I've brought that down to zero in some of my classes. So, my interest was piqued in the sense of, this is I know a consideration just anecdotally from my students, but it was nice to kind of very intentionally go at thinking about how I would utilize these resources, get a survey of what resources are out there. So I was glad for an opportunity to physically or to specifically drill down on that. Yeah.
Marie, what about you?
So, I mean, I'll echo a lot of what Sarah just said. I think the only thing that I would add is that, often even in lower division history courses, we think about the textbook as sort of ancillary to what we really want to do in the course, which is to get students to read and interpret materials, which is where the primary sources come in. But in order to do that effectively, students need to have content knowledge. And so we rely on the textbook to provide a lot of that context knowledge, and we'll give some more details in our courses and our lectures if we're lecturing. So one of the things that occurred to me and made me very interested in OER is that I didn't see the textbook necessarily as essential to my course to begin with. So I was like, well, if I'm going to ask students to buy it, I better use it more. And I was maybe leaning more on the textbook than actually I should have. So moving to OER was a moment for me to think about decentering the textbook in the course and really think about, how am I using the textbook reading? What do I actually want students to get from this? I really was able to reconceptualize what the purpose of the course was and what the purpose of the textbook was too.
Yeah,
I definitely, go ahead. I'm sorry, please.
With that, I think that, Marie and I have talked a lot about how not only what it's like to teach these classes, but how they fit together too, for students who are taking both of them or students who are only taking one of them. Our students are coming at these classes from a variety of different experience levels with American history, have come from a lot of different high schools. Some of them have more recent experience in a history classroom than others. And so to the point about decentering the textbook, I think the more that we can kind of sell that as, not that's the wrong word, but sell that as a resource for our students. Like if you haven't talked about the civil rights movement in a class recently, this chapter in the textbook is going to really kind of lay the groundwork for you in order to understand what we're doing in class exercises and in lectures and things like that too. So decentering the textbook also is an opportunity for us to sort of level the playing field as far as like what content knowledge the students, are coming in with or leaving our class with then.
I know the feeling, just to Marie's point, of I'm having the struggle too of asking myself, am I just cruising with my course? I don't use a textbook, but it feels as though I just need to dig into it and make some changes, but it's almost so intimidating that I don't know where to start. Was the grant opportunity, when you heard about it, and my first question is, how did you hear about it? But secondly, was the grant enough for you to really support you in this process?
So, the first question's easier to answer. I heard it from my chair, Zach Hearn in history, who's been very supportive of thinking about OER materials. So it sort of went through the network at ISU. The question of, is the grant enough? I think for what I did for my course, which is adopt materials that already exist, yes. I think, for instance, I teach another gen ed course, U.S. Women's History. There is no OER textbook or materials for that. So if I were to want to adopt OER for that particular course, that's a multi-year project because I would have to actually create the material versus just find it and decide what I want to use. So I think for a situation like the one that Sarah and I were in, where there are OER textbooks for U.S. history surveys already available, I think the grant gave an appropriate amount of resources to devote some time to seeking out these things, and the time that it takes to implement them into our courses, get them up on Moodle, think about creating quizzes and tests and material that relates to the OER textbook.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Sorry. I was about to jump in with my next question.
No, that's okay. Back to the original point about, we teach U.S. history, and U.S. history surveys are at every college and university and community college in the country. And so publishers have recognized that there's a big niche there as far as what textbooks and what primary source collections are needed. It's expensive for a publisher to make an OER text. It's even more expensive to make that peer reviewed or some equivalent thereof. And so obviously, the folks that put these things together want to make sure that they have the widest possible audience. So it is easier. We actually have several pretty high quality options that we can draw on that are completely free, that are completely open access. But I too teach courses where this doesn't work, right? So I'm teaching a US history and culture class that's centered around food history. And while there are some really interesting books out there about, textbooks, so to speak, they're not open access because that's way too niche of a subject. So anyway, I think for me, the grant opportunity was a chance to actually read through these things, make sure that I found what I needed, in order to support the sorts of things that I like to teach in those courses, do a little bit of quality control, because some of the more crowdsourced versions have drawbacks as far as how they're written in particular. So really for me, it was surveying what's available, really taking time to read closely what is available, and then figuring out what works for my class. And then, like Marie said, developing the surrounding content and materials that we teach with.
For sure. So like digging into the process, like where the rubber meets the road, like what did you do? How did you wind up finding the OER that you did adopt? And, how much time would you say that it took you to do that? And what tools did you use and the evaluation process? Like speak to that experience.
I can go first with this one if you want. I kind of whittled it down to 3 or 4 possible kind of sets that I might use. And what I did is I just spent time kind of looking looking at the structure. So because US history surveys are ubiquitous, the textbooks are usually split into 14 or 15 chapters. And so do those chapters track against, how I would pace the class, right? So something like that. Do these chapters for me, do they go beyond political history? Because me as a historian, we can learn about presidents and Congress and stuff, but I need to dig in beyond that. I want to talk about gender. I want to talk about culture. I want to talk about pop culture. So do the textbooks give me some backbone content that speaks to those concerns as well? And that traces back to sort of our training as historians. Some of us are we're social historians or we're economic historians. So we want to make sure the text that we're using fits along the lines of, the emphases. We're back to that once again. So, not only looking at the structure of the book, but then taking a look through it, figuring out what primary sources fit with it, because one drawback is that some of the textbooks don't have nice, tidy, matching primary source collections. So then it becomes, this is the hard copy of the OER textbook that I ended up using, then it becomes, okay, well, so for chapter 4, what sorts of primary sources would I want my students to read up alongside this, or what could we do in class? So it's a lot of just that, it's kind of like course alignment mapping in a lot of ways. Shout out Daphne, who is my instructional design partner for the Quality Matters process. But yeah, there are the big questions, and then you kind of filter down into the smaller kind of nitty gritty day-to-day. What would the syllabus look like with this book?
Yeah. So to just tack on to what Sarah said about this, I had authored parts of chapters of the OER textbook that I use, the American Yop. I did that in grad school, and it has tons and tons and tons of authors who have contributed, which, as Sarah mentioned, can be good and bad. It's harder to get a coherent narrative, but it's also nice to get different perspectives from historians who specialize in different things. So, there's, I think, pros and cons to using it. So I knew what main textbook I wanted to use going in. I did a little bit of looking at the textbook that Sarah uses, for instance, when she had mentioned it to me. And I decided, no, I really like this one that I've worked with. What was a little bit more of a challenge for me was finding primary sources. So for early American history, which is what I do, yes, there's a lot of things that are digitized and freely available, but sometimes the format isn't one that's going to work for my course. The manuscript documents, for instance, can be tricky for students. In early American history and colonial, there is a language problem because a lot of the sources aren't in English. So I had to really consider what kinds of sources I'd like to use, and if they were ones that my students would benefit from reading or examining or looking at. So that took some time. I was familiar with some things from my own research that I used, databases like the Library of Congress's Chronicling America newspaper database. There's things that I have used myself. And so I knew, oh, okay, I bet that they have something that I can use for this course. And then there's the sort of flip side problem that often when we give students primary sources, we're giving them a very sanitized, edited down version that is nicely typed up for them. And so the students don't always get the historical context. Where does this source fit into this larger story? How are we to understand that it had an editor, multiple interpreters, a translator, etc.? So what you're getting is not exactly what the person wrote. And I needed to find sources that were at the same time accessible, but also conveyed that this is not how the source appeared in the original. And some of the OER textbook, some of the OER primary source readers that exist don't do a very good job of that contextualization, which is why I didn't use one. I cobbled together other primary sources on my own. I really tried very hard to look for an OER monograph, so a single author historical book about a particular topic. In my course, not OER, I've assigned one on Pocahontas, one on Ona Judge and George Washington, etc. I really wanted to find an OER monograph like that because I think it's helpful for students to see what historians have written and what that looks like, the sort of end process. I wasn't able to find that. It was really tricky, and I know Sarah could speak to some of this, but publishers of academic monographs are interested in OER, but it requires a lot of funding and subvention from the employer of the person writing it. And so there just aren't those resources quite yet. I'm hopeful that there will be in the future.
Yeah, me too. I mean, more comes out every year, and some of these problems are becoming evident. So I think that is really useful to take a look at what you wanted but wasn't there, and hopefully that we can put that out into the universe, as I'm sure other people are experiencing the same thing. But I was also wondering, and you kind of referenced this, were there particular instructional challenges that you were hoping to solve, and did OER kind of allow you to do that or open up your pedagogy?
Well, for me, having some dedicated time to specifically cater, well, especially for the primary sources, taking the time to specifically pull together the exact primary sources that I wanted, or at least what I could get of what I wanted. Actually, that customization process was great. Again, we're sort of doing that already in a lot of our classes, whether OER or not. But the thing that's actually harder is that you've really limited what kind of textbook options you're talking about if we're talking about OER. And so the the customization doesn't work as well with the textbook. The customization works really well for the documents and the primary sources and that sort of thing. But again, like reframing this as the course is not centered around the textbook really helps with that. Lessens some of the pressure on the textbook to be perfect, because then we have, 2 class sessions every week to lecture and discuss and fill in the blanks in other directions too. That's the first thought. Marie, do you have some other?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you've said. I think decentering the textbook was part of it. Thinking about how I can hit more of the student learning outcomes for Objective 6 courses, which are all about building skills and learning about methodology, which is not textbook based. In fact, it's sort of based in what I'm calling, I created new assignments that I call history labs, where students engage in the work that historians do. They use databases, they do research, they interpret materials, they look at maps. I have them transcribe a document or transcribe an oral history at one point. That one's always really popular. And so, part of solving the part of the problem that was solved in using the OER was sort of getting less reliant on the textbook and turning instead to these skills-based assignments and asking the students to use the textbooks to help them as they're completing these assignments, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know we had talked about those assignments. Remind me, did you want to share your screen? You're welcome to.
I can describe them. I mean, it's just a list of
sure.
like a list of instructions. But yeah, I've developed now, I think there's 10 of them. And they correspond to a different point in the course. Like one of the first ones is really basic. I just give them 3 primary source documents, one by a Spanish priest, one by French Jesuit missionaries, and the other one's an indigenous man's account of the Pueblo Revolt. And they go through these documents and think about, they answer questions essentially. Was this translated? Do we get information about that? How do they compare to one another? How do they give us differing perspectives on a very similar event? And then I have ones that are much more in depth. There's a really terrific effort out of Emory University to create a very large scale database of the transatlantic slave trade. And I have students go into that database and find information and interpret it. Another one, I mentioned the transcription one, that is super popular. I use my own research. I have photographs of letters that I am using in my book, and I give students some of the photographs of these letters and ask them to sort of piece together what's happening. Trying to think of some of the others. I've got one with maps, for instance, where students have to interpret a map and figure out where it actually is what map is actually showing, which can be tricky for the earlier period. Another one uses one of the library databases, the American Antiquarian Society, which is like the center for early American print culture. They have a database of historical periodicals from the 19th century. And so I have students do a mini research project with that. Basically, particularly now in this moment where we're thinking about how to adapt things to online, right? And this is a course that I've taught online. I've taught it asynchronous, synchronous, I've taught it face-to-face. I mean, like whatever flavor you want, I can teach it. Normally when we're face-to-face, we can bring the student to the archive and show them what these things look like. But, in this iteration of the course that's online, a lot of it is OER materials or databases that I'm having them use in these labs.
Yeah, I think exposing students to databases has become a big priority of mine, not just because of OER, but just generally. I also teach a gen ed course in information literacy, which is one of the ISU specific numbers. But, just introducing students to the concept that any database or archive or library, right? Somebody chooses what goes into that collection, right? and just kind of opening students' eyes to the fact that what we have digitized, or what appears in a search engine, or what appears in a library's archives, is very mediated, right? And this is a methodological question, like all the way up through all of our PhD coursework deals with this. And I don't think it's unreasonable to introduce, freshmen or first year students or gen ed students to that concept too, because it starts to get them not only thinking about the skills to actually use a database, but also, the kind of effort and selective process that goes into that. So, like, pedagogically speaking, I wouldn't do this in the first primary source assignment, but maybe later in the semester, like having students just go flip through a whole bunch of primary sources that are on like the National Archives or the Library of Congress or something, and witness how that comes together, I think is really, really valuable. And you can kind of every once in a while, like, see their brains explode a little bit and they're like, oh, wait, somebody had to like sit and actually scan these things. I'm like, yeah, it's a work study student or a grad student or an intern. Like, somebody sat there with a scanner and put this in the system. So I mean, that's always a pretty satisfying thing to teach as well, to impart on my students.
I'm so with you. I myself love to teach information literacy and ask those questions of students. So I think what you're describing here, it's really making clear just how much work and, hard work, intellectual investment goes into revising any class, but doing it with OER, doing it with these primary sources, and taking a textbook and figuring out, mapping your learning goals to, okay, chapter 1, chapter 17, right? So my question would be, what additional support would have been most helpful for you during that time, whether it comes from the administration, your department, or someplace else? And I know ITRC already did it in fantastic work. But Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, we've already kind of alluded to this, but sort of concurrently to receiving this grant and doing the work on this grant, I was nearing the the finishing stages of my own first book, getting my own first book out into the world, and in sort of the contract process of that, it became apparent just how many resources or what degree of resources is necessary to actually put an OER textbook out into the world. That was an option that was given to me by my editor at Cornell University Press. But in order for the book to be fully free and clear, fully open access, requires a subvention of about $15,000. Right. And some universities have pools of money to make that happen. Some don't. ISU does not. And I asked around quite a lot. I bugged a lot of people about this because I would love to see my book out in the world freely accessible. It's not a textbook per se, but I think it could be used in a lot of different undergraduate courses. That being said, it made me, so I'm not going that route with my own book because I simply don't have the resources to do so. But it got me thinking about what this process would look like for somebody in a different discipline. In history, like we can kind of maneuver the pieces around and figure out a system that works. But if we're talking about a math textbook or a chemistry textbook or something like that, and needed to build that from the ground up, how different an ask that it really is. So, again, the caveats about this whole conversation are that history kind of does one thing, but the needs of OER are going to look so different for other disciplines. And not only the possibility of like paying a publisher, having a subvention for a publisher to get something freely accessible to everybody, but where do you host that? Where's the web, where's the web space? The time it takes to put that together, the time it takes to review that. And moreover, regardless of discipline, this isn't something that fits into our tenure and promotion categories very well. And so, like, not only how do you get the resources of time and money to make that happen, but how do you make it useful for your own promotion, right? How do you make this worth it professionally, right? So this isn't really, that isn't really a question specific to my process, but rather the big questions that this, this whole process kind of brought up for me.
Yeah, I think to sort of add to your last point, Sarah, I think we both teach other gen ed courses aside from the US survey that we don't have OER materials for. They don't exist. That I would love to have an OER US women's history textbook. That would be awesome. But I need to get tenure, and the currency in my field is research, and a textbook is not categorized as research. So, that might be a post-tenure project, but I think it would be really great to see some additional support for the creation of OER textbooks, whether in the form of course releases, et cetera, realizing that this is a massive undertaking that requires a lot of time if you're going to create your own textbook. And two, that it could be very beneficial, and not just beneficial to students at ISU or in Idaho, that could be beneficial to students nationwide. I mean, the textbook I use for the OER US history textbook, American Yawp, I mean, that was somebody in Texas who sort of pulled it all together, and that textbook is used nationwide, I would imagine even internationally. So this can benefit students everywhere. It just is a matter of the time to be able to create something like that.
I saw this meme recently. It was something about like YouTube tutorials are propping up society at this point. And I feel like there's a parallel here to amazing OER is coming together because of a few dedicated people. And to extend the analogy, how do we monetize that for those people? Because with a textbook publisher, it's like you have a book and you're selling it over and over again. The amount of investment in that book hasn't changed. It's already written. So you just get great material written. So I would love to see more institutional support for OER personally at ISU, and it's the drum, of course, that I bang a lot. And so I think you've really spoken to that, and especially to the need for, to support in Sarah's case. And congratulations on your book. Is it Atomic Americans? Did I see that? Yeah, it sounds awesome.
That's what it's called. It'll be out in a year, in another year.
Is there advice that you would give? And let me stop and say first, if anyone else has questions, please feel free to enter them at any time. But I'm going to continue to monopolize your time for a little bit longer if no one else has questions. I'd love to know, is there a particular piece of advice that you would give to someone who's intrigued by the idea of revising their course to use OER, and they're maybe not sure where to start, or they're a little trepidatious?
I would say, it's the advice that we give with teaching in general, which is start small. Start with small things that you can implement that will immediately make a difference. So if you're somebody who you have 2 textbooks that you use in your course, can you think, is there one OER textbook that I could use to replace one of these? Are there sort of supplemental materials that I'm having my students buy that I can actually find something else to replace them with? Because it is, if you're going to change out everything, that requires a lot of course design. But if you can think about what are the manageable bits of this, what are the pieces of my course that I could develop? For an upper division US history course, for instance, we typically assign a few monographs, maybe 3 to 4 monographs corresponding with different units in the course. So a redesign for OER for that might be replacing one of those monographs. And then the next time you teach it, you can do the other one, et cetera, et cetera. But to think about what you can actually accomplish in a semester, to start to make those changes. I also think it's really valuable, and Sarah and I have chatted about this a lot because we both are US historians who've taught the survey. If there's somebody else in your field that's teaching whatever course it is that you're teaching, like Intro to Sociology or Chemistry 101 or whatever, there's certainly a faculty member somewhere who has converted that course to OER. Definitely reach out to them and ask. I found that people are very willing to share materials, to share ideas. to make this a really collaborative process, especially if there's somebody who's invested in OER and to open access generally. They're very likely going to share things with you.
I would also add that thinking about the materials from the student's perspective was really helpful for me. And this goes back to good course design and alignment and all that stuff. But using OER just to use OER and not thinking about how it fits in is frustrating for the students, right? When I've been in courses where we didn't really use the required materials, and especially if I was paying for them, that was annoying. But even if they were free, it might be frustrating to a student if it doesn't feel aligned to what's going on in the class. They wouldn't use that language, of course. But so thinking about it from the student's perspective, this hasn't come up yet, so I'll mention it now, but one of the reasons I ended up working with this text, it's a 2-volume Building the American Republic that University of Chicago Press puts out, is that you can buy it in paper for $20, like this one, or you can use it for free online as PDF, e-reader, whatever. And so I tell my students at the beginning of class, like, hey, you have options here. If you know your study methods, if you're accustomed to writing in the margins, if you're accustomed to underlining, like if you like to do that on e-readers, if you read better on a screen, like use the version that works for your learning preferences. And so and students, anecdotally, students have really appreciated that, having options too. So that's just one example of trying to think of this from the student's perspective of what's easy for them to get. I think about this all the time with online classes, but not like trying to minimize the number of modalities that students have to use across an online class. Like they're on Moodle, they're on Google Docs, they're on Dropbox, they're on this publisher's website. That can get overwhelming, especially for students who have never taken an online class before, or, any kind of student. So trying to take it from that perspective adds another layer of complexity to doing this, another layer of work to doing this. But I think that that's a valuable kind of reality check too. I had a friend in grad school who used to say, when you're designing a syllabus, like, do a draft and then take 2 things off. He called it the Coco Chanel methodology, right? Get dressed and then take 2 accessories off or something. I feel the same way about how we bring together digital sources in our classes. Use the ones that are best, use the ones that are the biggest bang for your buck. That might be advice I would give.
That's awesome. We're at the end of our time. I just wanted to quickly ask Marie, would you share again the name of the book that you had contributed to, the OER?
Sure. It's called American YAWP, YAWP. There we go.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's a reference to Walt Whitman's poetry, Barbarous Yawp.
And that was the project you did as a grad student?
Yeah. So I contributed when I was a grad student. I mean, one of the neat things about it too is that it's constantly being updated. So it goes through a revision every year, and different contributors get pulled in as new scholarship comes out in the field. The text gets updated. So it's that's one of the things that's really nice about it. Some of the issues that were in earlier versions of it have been resolved because of feedback from faculty who are using it.
It's fantastic. Well, the labor of grad students is always at our disposal right now. There's a whole conversation at OER about how do we recognize grad students and the unpaid work of grad students. But I think that's amazing. And I'll have to check that out. I wish I could take both of your courses. They sound awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate your time. It's valuable. And thanks for supporting OER at ISU.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Oh, don't go yet. I have an evaluation form. I'm just going to paste it in the chat. If anyone would like to give us some feedback. Shoot, some people left. I always forget. All righty. But you guys can go. I'll just wait and keep the Zoom open just in case anyone else needs the link. But
Great.
great. Have a great afternoon.
You
Yeah,
too.
you
Thank
too.
you. Bye-bye.
Hello, Christine. I'm going to turn off the live.
Yes.